وعليكم السلام جزاك الله خير.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألف لام ميم أحسب الناس أن يتركوا أن يقولوا آمنا وهم لا يفتنون ولقد فتنا الذين من قبلهم فليعلمن الله الذين صدقوا وليعلمن الكاذبين أم حسب الذين يعملون السيئات أن يسبقونا ساء ما يحكمون من كان يرجو لقاء الله فإن أجل الله لآت وهو السميع العليم ومن جاهد فإنما يجاهد لنفسه إن الله لغني عن العالمين والذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات لنكفرن عنهم سيئاتهم ولنجزينهم أحسن الذي كانوا يعملون ووصينا الإنسان بوالديه حسنا وإن جاهداك لتشرك بي ما ليس لك به علم فلا تطعهما إلي مرجعكم فأنبئكم بما كنتم تعملون والذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات لندخلنهم في الصالحين ومن الناس من يقول آمنا بالله فإذا أوذي في الله جعل فتنة الناس كعذاب الله ولئن جاء نصر من ربك ليقولن إنا كنا معكم أوليس الله بأعلم بما في صدور العالمين وليعلمن الله الذين آمنوا وليعلمن المنافقين وقال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا اتبعوا سبيلنا ولنحمل خطاياكم وما هم بحاملين من خطاياهم من شيء إنهم لكاذبون وليحملن أثقالهم وأثقالا مع أثقالهم وليسألن يوم القيامة عما كانوا يفترون.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. So just to begin off with, the first thing I'd like to do on behalf of myself and Arslan is to thank all of the ISocs who have put together this talk, and for all of the marketing team and everyone that's contributed to this. And anything that is done for the sake of Allah is something which will benefit us in this life and in the hereafter. So on behalf of myself and Arslan, firstly, a big thank you to everybody. And Assalamu alaikum Arslan.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Again, just to echo what you just said, I want to thank all the ISocs, all the universities that have joined to make this event possible. And I'm glad to be with talking with my brother Subboor Ahmad on this very critical issue. Yeah.
Okay. And the other thing I just wanted to mention briefly is whenever we thank the creation, and as the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever doesn't thank the creation doesn't thank Allah, it's not empty words. I mean, Arslan, I believe this is the first time you've been invited to a cross-panel, sort of many universities across the UK. I believe this is the first time it's been done for you, right?
Yep.
So, mashallah, I mean, just a quick introduction into Arslan. Arslan is a Uyghur rights activist, a very prominent one. Talk to East Turkestan is his organization alongside others. And what he does is he connects all of these sort of activists around the world around this cause. He's been on BBC, Al Jazeera, TRT, and many different media outlets speaking about the oppression in Chinese-occupied East Turkestan. And Arslan is actually from that region, and he's been to that region. He has family in that region, and he has family that's directly been affected by the Chinese oppression, including members of his family who've been put into concentration camps, and the fact that he cannot actually travel to East Turkestan. And additionally, he will tell you of other issues that he's actually had. And Talk to East Turkestan is the organization which is there to try and highlight this issue as much as possible. So what we're going to be doing today, inshallah, is we're going to begin off with firstly the history of the region. Who are the Uyghurs? What is their history with China? Are they Chinese? And what's basically been going on in this region recently, especially in the last couple of decades, in the last couple of years in particular. And lastly, we're going to be speaking about what you can do in terms of the main different university students which are going to be watching this, and people outside of university, and why your demographic in particular is extremely important to highlight this cause more so than other demographics. So over to you, Arslan, in terms of the history of the region. Give us a brief outline of who are the Uyghurs and why is this topic so important?
Well, thank you again. Basically, we've got to start off with who are the Uyghurs, and the Uyghurs are a Turkic people. And when we talk about Turks, Turks have a very long history, even before Islam. Turks, depending on where you're reading from, people say 4, 5, perhaps even 6,000 years of Turkic history. But if we want to make it more relevant to us now, instead of giving a whole lesson on Turkic history, the Turks, when they finally meet with Islam, it is actually the Uyghurs who introduced Islam to the Turks. And this is in the early 10th century, in 934, by a king at the time by the name of Sultan Subboor Ahmad, under the Karahan Empire, and he is the first out of the Turkic nations to accept Islam, and eventually his tribe and his people accept Islam, and the Uyghurs as a whole accept Islam over the next few hundred years. So we're talking before the Ottomans, before the Seljuks, before Ertugrul and all these people, and then you have a slow expansion of Islam throughout the next hundreds of years. And when we think the Turks and China and we in this geographical location, we also have to talk about the Mongols and the Great Wall of China. And we know that the main reason that the Great Wall of China was built was because of wars with the Turks and the Mongols. And so that would be the far most border of the Turkic Empire. Eventually, you get all the way with the Huns that reach all the way to Hungary. So you're talking about this really expansive of thousands of year history. Anyways, when we're talking about the Uyghurs specifically, so the Uyghurs through various empires, we have the Uyghur state, which expands, and then when we get to about 1759, this is where the Chinese under the Manchu Empire take over the land of the Uyghurs. East Turkestan is a name that we will get into a little later, but in 1759 the Uyghurs are taken over by the Chinese, but there is like 100-year war within the Manchu Empire, and we do again the Uyghurs gain some sort of independence from them, but then that is short-lived. And in about 1884, the Chinese under the Manchu Empire named the land of the Uyghurs Xinjiang, and that is what is known as today Xinjiang, which literally means new territory or new frontier. And you'll hear the Chinese say, well, this land has always been a part of China. Well, actually, the name that you've given it, calling it the new territory, doesn't suggest that at all. Once the name Xinjiang is given in 1884, the Manchus are overthrown by Chinese nationalists. The Chinese nationalists are different to the Chinese communists. Present-day Chinese nationalists reside in what we know now today as the Republic of China, which is Taiwan. And in 1911, the Chinese nationalists take over Xinjiang, or the land of the Uyghurs, up until 1933. In 1933, the Uyghurs established, along with other Turkic minorities, the East Turkestan Islamic Republic, and the capital based in Kashgar, which is a city which borders with very closely with Afghanistan. And that republic is short-lived. It goes for about 6 months or so. And we are again taken over by the Chinese nationalists. And during the period of World War II, where the whole world is in this world war, the Uyghurs gain, again, independence in between 1944 and 1949, and we established the East Turkestan Republic, this time the capital towards the north of East Turkestan. And in 1949, the Chinese communists take over, and they establish the People's Republic of China, which still lasts today, and they take over our land and annexing it. And in 1955, we are officially given the name the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And that name was given, and that status was given, so that the Uyghurs do not revolt once more or wouldn't want to gain independence once more. And they promise us many things. And so the Uyghurs sort of settle for that sort of autonomous status. But from that day, we'll get into what happened with the concentration camps, but sort of the oppression has really started under the communist regime from 1949 onwards. Whether it be, we talk about, I'm not sure how this is going to be, whether if I should just keep going, or are you going to?
Just carry on. I just wanted to add a small thing here that about the autonomous region, the way that it's actually named, and to try and pacify them.
Yeah.
Could you go into the status of that as it currently stands? Because even though the name is there any autonomy? And you can just sort of carry. I'll interject where.
So it's the whole region right now. It's called the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, but within the region itself, there are other autonomous regions. So there are Mongolian autonomous regions, Kyrgyz autonomous regions, Kazakh autonomous regions within the Uyghur autonomous region. And that is to even split up the country further. So there is no way of the Uyghurs coming together or groups coming together, because China has just split up these groups, and this is your land and that's your land. And so, but in actual practice, we don't have a vote. We don't control our own natural resources. And there is nothing autonomous about it. We are controlled by Beijing and the Chinese. And if we're talking about present day, so Xi Jinping. So it's a top down where you've got this leader, this king, essentially, General Secretary Xi Jinping. He's the king, and he just gives out orders. And we all know that China is, non-democratic, or there is no vote. It's not like a people set up system. They vote for themselves. It essentially is an imperialist system where it's run within the same family. So the first leader, the president, or the general secretary, Mao Zedong, and then you have Deng Xiaoping. So all these guys are related one way or another. And so for example, the first sort of thing that they would do is they, just like with any sort of oppressive regime, they get rid of all the smart intellectuals, the businessmen, they kill them off, or they demonize them within the society, because there is a period of where communism is taught and being rich, and these things are all evil, and the rich people, and education is lost, this is not just happening to the Uyghurs. Broadly within China, the Chinese people themselves destroy their own culture as well, because the Chinese have their own rich culture of thousands of years, and whether it be the scrolls of their own, say, traditional Chinese medicine, or their own culture, they destroy their own culture as well. So culture is demonized. It's seeing something as backward, and they have to evolve. And it's not until the first thing that happens to the Uyghurs is the language. So just like what Ataturk did with the Turks, the Chinese changed the language of the Uyghurs from the Arabic script to the Latin script. Now you might say, okay, this is a way for the Uyghurs to sort of, evolve and be part of the world, and learn the Latin script and do this, right? But the whole idea of that was to make the people illiterate, because 20 years later, so 62 was the first letter change, and in 82 they changed it back to the Arabic. So they have two generations of people that are illiterate overnight. So their intention was not to uplift or bring the Uyghurs into the modern day life. It was to make them illiterate, so that they would have to rely on the stable Chinese language, right? And throughout over these years, there have been stages of cullings or events where, so for example, we see this in the 70s and 80s. In the 1990s, 1990s specifically, we have something called the Baran massacre, where the Uyghurs were standing up because their children were being aborted, because China had introduced the one-child policy, but for the minorities, the two-child policy. And with people like the Uyghurs, the Turkic people or Arab people, we have many children, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 children, and the Uyghurs were not going to have that. So they were met with gunfire and they were massacred. We don't know how many thousands, we don't have clear numbers, because I'm sure you've seen, even with COVID, China doesn't like to leak out or give out real numbers of deaths in any matter. In 1997, we have something called the Gulden.
Okay, so sorry to cut you off, Arslan. Just before that, about the Baran massacre, it wasn't just a case of state-imposed restrictions. It was also that they were taking Uyghur women and forcibly aborting and killing the children.
So on April 5, 1990, like forced abortions, regardless of where they were in term. And this was and you can read an amazing study done by Adrian Zenz, who talks about this forced abortion, and the birth rate, especially in the last 3 years, has pretty much gone down to 0. So you will see the generation born in the 80s and further, those parents having 2 children or less. And the ones that do have 3 or 4 children, either their spouse is a citizen of another country, or they had to pay a hefty fine, or they had to spend some time in prison for that child to survive. And that 3rd or 4th child actually somehow ends up living, but is not able to register, and without registering, you can't go to school, you can't get a bank account, you can't go to university, and you just live sort of. And I've met many people who, until they were 60 or 65, somehow they were, by the will of Allah, they were able to reach overseas, and they only ever received actual papers when they were 60 or 65 years old. Like for the first time, they had their name on pieces of paper. They had their name on a birthday. They had to come up with their own. I know people who had to come up with their own birth date. They just had to make it up on the spot because they didn't have any papers on them. So we have this issue. And so every 10 years, there is a culling of people in the society. And we reach and we have seen and we have heard say the least oppressive thing is like probably, and you guys will think, oh no, that's very bad, but say the demolition of mosques, the banning of Islam. And when we say banning of Islam, you think, oh, is it hijab? Is it the bead? And you have these things in the West, or the niqab is banned. But when I say banning of Islam, I'm saying assalamu alaikum, having a beard, saying things like, Brother Subboor, you shouldn't be smoking. That is haram. See that statement? That would get me into prison. So good nasiha, good advice, forbidding the good, forbidding the evil, and calling to the good, that will get you into prison. So when we talk about banning of Islam, this sort of banning of Islam isn't seen, as far as I know, not even in Palestine. You know what I mean? So like, no Quran, no nothing, like nothing at all. Like even asking, brother, is this food halal? Why are you asking? Why are you asking? It's halal. Are you okay? Is there something wrong in your mind? So Islam is seen as a disease, and that's the lowest form of oppression. So that's the lowest form of oppression. And then you've got people going, once they are convicted of such crimes, they go into camps or prisons.
Okay. So just before that, recently there was some information that was put online about how some of these cases that, like you said, if somebody is saying Assalamu alaikum, or they are showing any sign of religiosity, but it's even the case of somebody switching their phone on and off regularly, or something benign like that. Anything that just is it's almost arbitrary, right? I mean, that's the sort of information we're getting now.
Yeah, so for example, they have this special application, and if you go into the region, they make you download it onto your phone. You have to download it if you want to enter the region, and it's called iJob. You can literally search this up, IJOP, go to Human Rights Watch, and it gives an amazing explanation of what it is. What it is it tracks each and every move. So whether you enter your house from the front door or the back door. So if you're normally someone that enters from the front door, and you suddenly one day decide to enter from the back door, all right, let's talk to this guy. How come he's suddenly wanting to enter from the back door? How do they know you're entering from the back door? Because there are QR codes in your home. There are the cameras everywhere, AI technology. Another one is, if you're suddenly using more electricity this month than last month, is this person housing someone in his home? Why are you suddenly using more electricity? Why are you using more gas? How come you filled up more petrol this month than last? So any sort of difference in your lifestyle, there's a red flag, and they interview you straight away. There's something going on in this guy's life. And even though there's something may not be going on, just when you do get that knock on the door, it's to let that person know that we're watching you. Look, you filled up $10 extra this month. How come? So you've got this sort of, you're being watched. And we've gotten into a situation where Uyghurs are doxing other Uyghurs because every Uyghur feels like they're being watched. And a crime could be that if you're not dobbing or doxing a fellow Uyghur, then you could get into trouble as well. How come you didn't, this guy's thing changed, he ended up doing something, or he said something, you didn't report this, now you're going to be in trouble. So it's 1984 on like steroids and whatever drug. It's like, it's simply unheard of. And to be honest, a lot of regimes and even democracies out there would love to have this power that China has right now. And you see certain sort of democracies go this way. So now when we get to these concentration camps, that's what they essentially are. These concentration camps are essentially...
Okay, sorry to interject again, but like the examples you're giving are obviously quite high level from the perspective that you need a very sophisticated technological state to actually apply them. But apart from that, they do have this very crude way of managing people in terms of you were telling me earlier some months back about if you go inside a shop, the butchers who is cutting meat, it'll actually be chained to it. And as you're walking through the market, you'll have these people who are just waiting there, and if something looks odd, they'll just take you aside. I mean, it's not just they're using technology. There's people everywhere watching every move.
Yeah, it's literally like there are some movies out there that sort of highlight this as well. I can't go through all of them, but yeah. So even knives, people aren't allowed to have knives unless it's chained up, and knives. Just like you would need to register a gun on your ID, you literally need to register a butcher knife or a cutting knife that you cut your vegetables with as well. So that's how much that's how these people are controlled. Because the reason why I mention this is like, well, how come the Uyghurs don't fight back? I'm like, if you're living in such a society, how are you going to fight back? With what? And there are no countries around the border that sort of can, support you in any way, because all the countries surrounding East Turkestan, so we're talking Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, India, Russia, Mongolia, all these countries are bought. And the Uyghurs also have nowhere to run. And another question pops up, well, why don't we see a big influx of people like the Syrians running? How come we don't see hundreds of thousands of refugees? Yeah. Where are they going to run to? Like some of the tallest mountains in the world surround East Turkestan. And if you look up in the Guinness Book of Records, we are geographically the furthest away from the ocean. So it's like we're in this spot where geographically in itself is a prison, and you've got the strongest nation, and people go, or how, I'm sure you get these comments as well about where they compare Bosnia and Syria, and dude, we're dealing with China. Like, it's not Bosnia. Like Bosnia is like a walk in the park. Like the people, compared to China, I mean, it's like 1,000-fold with the technology, with their politics, with their diplomacy and everything. So yeah, and today when we're talking about the concentration camps, it's essentially the reason why these concentration camps are set up and why the Chinese regime does this is to assimilate the Uyghurs. And those who don't assimilate die. And when we're talking about assimilation, it's not like, for example, you're in Britain and I'm in Australia and we should assimilate into Australian society and learn the language or whatnot, right? But that's not enough for the Chinese regime. Sorry,
just to cut you off, I just wanted to add a few points. So one of the points is that it's not the situation where the Uyghurs are collectively fighting the Chinese, so the Chinese decided to oppress them. It's not the case that the claims that the Chinese government makes that there's extremists and terrorists within that region, and therefore they're fighting extremism and terrorism, because there's been multiple reports done by people who are impartial, people who are not against. I mean, they don't really have a dog in the fight. And these are historians and other sorts of people who've basically said these groups are made up. This idea that there's these extremists who live, because Uyghurs as a people, they have become quite, just to be able to practice even the basics of Islam is extremely difficult, So just to clarify, it's not the case like you were highlighting earlier that in Bosnia there was actually Muslims who were fighting against the Serbs and NATO and other countries are supporting them and they're fighting and then there's a war going on. It's simply the case of a giant state versus a small group of people, and that group of people didn't start the fight. And extremism and terrorism and the Uyghurs are completely away from that as a people. This is just something that after 9/11, they just started adopting this language, because prior to 9/11, the Chinese never had the terminology of extremism and terrorism. All they were trying to do was they kept calling it separatism, right? And the reason why I'm highlighting this and I'm being particular about it is because the Chinese Communist Party's trolls that you see online, they will continuously try and post propaganda and other sorts of stuff to try and say, oh, you see these Uyghurs, they're actually terrorists, they're actually extremists, they're actually this, they're actually that. When in essence, we find none of those claims are actually founded on anything. And in fact, that there has been no major extremism or terrorism problem in that province. And if anything, the whole argument for East Turkestan as a state is not some gigantic, Islamic state. It was basically the simple, the right of self-determination, which many nations actually have. And if you look at what the 1944 East Turkestan Republic was, and you look at the constitution and you lock at these types of things, you just see it is an ethnic based state. It is not some gigantic Islamic state which is going to challenge everybody else and start invading everybody else. This is extremely important to highlight, because we don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that actually it's the extremism of the Uyghurs which in a way justifies the oppression against them. Because if we look at the countries the Muslim countries and other countries which are supporting China, they're buying into the narrative that there's something extreme about the Uyghurs, and they are doing something which is funded externally and stuff like this, when in reality all the Uyghurs have been asking is, let us have our children, let us pray, let us allow our children to be taught the Quran, let us just be able to breathe. In fact, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Arslan, much of the problem that we see on the ground in terms of the Uyghur independence movement and everything for the Chinese, those problems, they wouldn't even be so big if the Chinese simply allowed them to practice Islam, because they're not asking for anything more than to be able to simply follow the basic tenets of their religion.
Exactly. Generally speaking, before the concentration camps, Uyghurs have always been calling for independence, but the call for independence has become 1,000-fold because of the opening of the camps. And that's why you see so many activists out there right now. Before, there's still not that many, but we really didn't have that many, say 5 years ago. And as I mentioned before, the main reason for this, why especially they've gone to the level of concentration camps now, is that the Uyghurs are not Chinese enough. They don't live the Chinese lifestyle. So, when we use the word deen, the word deen doesn't simply mean religion. It means way of life. So when we, in our deen, the Uyghur deen or Islam deen, simply being Uyghur, speaking the Uyghur language, wanting to bring up our children as Muslims, as Uyghurs, not wanting to marry with Chinese people, opting to live a Uyghur lifestyle, these things are seen as extreme. And I've given the example where, so for example, Subboor, you are a British Muslim, yes? Right. But you are going to marry a Muslim. You're going to raise your children as Muslim. You're going to talk to your children in Urdu or whatever language. The British government is not going to lock you up for wanting to be that way, or for preaching Islam, or for speaking against atheism. You know what I mean? Or for not celebrating, you as a Muslim are not going to celebrate Christmas this year. So for being fundamentally un-British, the British government's not going to lock you up. So that's why I'm saying you are assimilated enough for British society. But if you were in China, if Britain was using the yardstick of what China was using, you wouldn't be British enough. And therefore, you would need to be locked up. You would be considered extreme, if people understand what I'm saying. So these concentration camps are for that. So once these people leave these concentration camps, either some of them end up going back into society, or they'll end up in labor camps, and for the ones that don't listen, that don't cooperate and are not able to assimilate the way that the Chinese want them to assimilate, they get killed through torture, food deprivation, sleep deprivation. Yeah.
Before we get into the concentration camps, because that's going to be a different thing itself. So we're going to go into the different people that you've interviewed personally, the family members, and what happens in the camps from A to Z. Before that, people like yourself and other Uyghur right activists who've been calling for Western intervention, right? And in fact, much more recently, there's been a lot of support amongst the European countries and American countries to actually support the Uyghur cause. And you're somebody who has a lot of connections in terms of this, in this regard. Now, the criticism that people like you face and others face is, why are you going to the West for help? Why aren't you turning to the Muslim world for help? why are you calling for Western intervention in Chinese occupied East Turkestan? And all of your narrative in terms of the talk to East Turkestan and the other interviews you've done on Al Jazeera, BBC, and all the other stuff, it's always asking for that type of intervention, right? And aligning yourself with those people. So wouldn't you face this sort of criticism from Muslims and from non-Muslims saying that this doesn't make sense? This seems like Uyghurs are just being opportunistic?
Well, the Uyghurs at the beginning, when China did go in, so if we go back to the 1880s when China was at war within the Manchu Empire, the Uyghurs were at war with the Manchus under the Chinese Empire, the Uyghurs gave bay'at to the Ottoman Empire. When the Uyghurs were first taken over by the Chinese communists, the first places that we went was Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. We went all over the Muslim world. The Muslim world knows of our plight, and we constantly knock on their doors saying, help us, save us. To this day, I'm constantly knocking on the doors of Muslim countries, the Turkish government, the Bahraini, like all over. I'm all over the shop. But they reply with, no, we agree with China. And we see this at the UN. A lot of these Muslim majority states support China and their camps. So that's what they're doing. So we go to them, but we don't get any help from them. The only help that we're getting is from, unfortunately, the West. And it is hypocritical because the West historically, especially in the first 20 years of this century, have been bombing the Middle East to Muslims back into the Stone Age. But unfortunately, if it wasn't for the West, if it wasn't for the United States, if it wasn't for the UK, the situation with the Uyghurs would be a lot worse. And to be honest, I thank Allah for the assistance that the West has given us. And that sounds so strange, doesn't it? Subhanallah. I can't believe I'm saying this.
On your channel, you've had people who I mean, as somebody who's trying to look at this from an objective point of view, I would say people who are very close to the corridors of power. So you've had, say, General Robert Spalding. I mean, there's other names which are slipping past me, but I'm sure you can remind us who they are. There was somebody when I was with you in Turkey, and you rang somebody who's pretty much, I believe, in the White House or around the White House or whatever it was, as in somebody close to the White House, whatever it is. So there's so much support coming directly. I just want to ask you this, that do you think this is short-lived? Do you think that this sort of interest that the Western world has with the Uyghur cause, if I was to look at it objectively, I would say the human rights organizations that are supporting the cause, they are in there for the long run. Amnesty International, Human Rights Project, and all the rest. But couldn't it be argued that the other sort of people who are giving a lot of support to people like yourselves, that's just very short-lived, because at the moment, China is just seen as something which is a thorn for the West?
Well, that's politics at the end of the day, isn't it? So right now, with Trump, right, we know his policies against Muslims. We know the Muslim ban, but yet he's signing bills into law which support Uyghur Muslims, so it's we in the world of politics. This is where we stand. I mean, and even when we look at places like Palestine, the leader of Palestine, Mahmoud Abbas, siding with China, where the Uyghurs, right, every Ramadan, when we used to be able to do Laylatul Qadr and fast and pray in the mosque, we would make dua for the Palestinians to free them from the Zionists. But today, Palestinians are with China, and the China supports Palestinians, and the Zionist government supports the Uyghurs. So this is what we call politics, and we're simply playing the game as well. So for example, subhanAllah, listen to this, brother. besides the right wing that we get the support from, we are getting so much support from India. Why are we getting support from India? Because India is at war with China. But the support we were supposed to be getting from was Pakistan, right? Pakistan siding with China. And every time I'm on Indian media, like the Modi regime, right? They bash Pakistan for not supporting the Uyghurs, but at the same time, the Indian government is oppressing Indian Muslims. So this is simply the world of politics, and I simply don't know what to say. And we're just part of the game, and we're just hoping for the best,
Yeah. So I think this is something which you've had a lot of academics on your show, and it's a very it's something that some of the guests previously have actually said on your show, that the Uyghur cause is such a good cause to actually support, because in a way it's where there's a dovetailing, right? There's a dovetailing of the interests of Western countries where Muslims are residing, and also the Western world, and generally something in which, look, it's like this. There's if there is to be a tsunami or an earthquake or something, people would come together and actually work on the solution. And we wouldn't say, okay, well, we don't want your help because you're Christian or you're Hindu or you're a Jewish person or something else. No, we would say, actually, no, we'd work together. So in this regard, I've been moved by the non-Muslim support for the Uyghur cause. And one particular person I want to highlight is I actually forgotten the name, but it's somebody who you had on your Talk to East Turkestan show, who worked for the UN, and she basically exposed them for pandering to China and giving the names of the Uyghur rights activists to the Chinese government. So can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Emily Riley is her name, and I believe she's still at the UN. They can't fire her. She's a human rights lawyer, and she got into human rights. She wanted to be a human rights lawyer because she cares about human rights. And she found out that since 2006, the UN was giving names of Uyghurs who are going to address the Human Rights Council, that major podium that we see all the time, straight to China weeks in advance. And so what would happen is China would go ahead and threaten the family members of that Uyghur person, whoever was going to speak up at the UN, and threaten them and put their family into prison. And this is happening since 2006. And she's the whistleblower that came out and let the world know about this. And her voice was heard basically on I believe the channel was LBC, Majid Nawaz's radio station. So and he was the one that sort of brought it up, and from there I knew of her. So and I was asking her, why are you doing this? Like, is it because you don't get that much money from the UN? What's happening? She goes, no, like apparently the perks are amazing. Besides the money, your children are, set up in private schools up until the age of 25 and all this stuff. And I'm like, why are you doing this? Because, well, I'm a human rights lawyer and I got into it for human rights and I can't be quiet about this. And there was a big investigation, and there was an internal, a UN court hearing where the judge was going to rule in her favor. And like a day before, the UN fired the judge, and it was just like, what kind of organization is this? Is this like a banana republic? We're talking about the UN, where people go to sort out human rights atrocities. And yet this organization puts into the Human Rights Council countries like China with the worst human rights record, who will now dictate what a human rights violation is. So there are, as you mentioned, non-Muslims out there, and on the surface, organizations that seem not just non-Muslim, but anti-Muslim and anti-Islamic organizations helping out in raising the situation of the Uyghurs.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Arslan, we're going to be coming to the hour mark soon. Could you just spend the next couple of minutes summarizing what are these concentration camps, and going into the sort of first-hand accounts that you've had from concentration camp survivors, before we move on to end with what people can actually do, and then take question and answers from them.
Yeah, so when we say concentration camps, we think about the Jews and the Jewish Holocaust. And generally speaking, I would label them as just one level below. There are people dying, but they're not being put into mass gas chambers and being killed off in the millions yet. And that's what we're worried about. That could be the next level. Based on what I've heard from former detainees, and based on experts, the number of camps range anywhere between like above 1,000 camps. And each of these camps are football stadiums in size. And in these camps, there are God knows how many cells. And the number of people dying in these camps, based on one detainee by the name of Mihrigul Tursun, she witnessed 9 people die in a 3-month period. And so for the women, they are tortured and raped on a schedule. It seems to be just part of the torture program. They are injected with a substance which makes them stop their periods. It also sort of turns them into zombies. They're not hungry anymore. They're telling me that they were on 400 to 500 calorie diets. They're given a sort of steam bun and sort of soupy substance on a daily basis. Their blood is taken every day. Their DNA, before they actually go into the camps, their retina, their DNA, their blood, everything is checked and put into a database, because the ones that do end up dying, their organs are harvested and sold to the highest bidders in the Middle East. And you can read about this by simply typing in halal organ harvesting. Read the articles of C.J. Werleman. I'm sure you've heard of him. They are, again, indoctrinated, told to repent. They repent to Xi Jinping, because they say Xi Jinping, or the king of China, is now their Lord, is now their Rabb, astaghfirullah. And they have to write letters to him repenting, because they used to repent to Allah. And so people are beaten if any sort of religiosity comes through. So, brother, you would remember that we interviewed a sister by the name of Zumrat Dawood, and she basically was tortured because she gave some food to an older woman, and when she was beaten, she said, "Oh Allah," and then she was beaten further because she said Allah. And she witnessed people being urinated on, and the guards were saying, "Don't you Muslims wash yourselves before you pray?" So denigration of the highest status, torturing, death, and a lot of these people leave the concentration camps, if they're lucky enough, just to go back to that. They're the luckiest ones, so just to sort of go back into society and like live like zombies. Then you've got people going back into labor camps, where they are given a salary, but it's nothing to what they were earning before. So let's just say if they were earning like $1,500 a month, now they're earning probably $100 or $200 a month. So the forced slave labor. Then you have people who are coming up paralyzed and as quadriplegics and mental diseases, not disease, because they were just beaten the hell out of, and they can't function anymore properly as a human. And yeah, these are just like a nutshell. I'm really summing it up here as to what's happening in these camps. And a lot of people are simply, for the ones that China deemed that they can't be helped or cured, because they can tell the ones who sort of fake trying to assimilate, because you can fake it. Like, yes, I'll be loyal. They're given hefty prison sentences. And I know many people who their parents or their brothers and sisters were sentenced to 10, 20 years, 15 years, arbitrarily. There are no courts. It's just like all right, you did this, all right, you prayed, all right, 15 years. You got a bead, 10 years. You were in for this. You gave some nasiha to someone, all right, that's 20. Like, you just don't know. And yeah, people are disappearing on the face of the earth. And and this is why we not just call for Western intervention, we need Western military intervention, because the West did it 75 years ago to take down Hitler, and I would say Xi Jinping is worse than Hitler, because at least I'm talking to you about some of these tortures, but to be honest, for these people just to be, for some of them to just be killed and to be gas chambered would be much more of a mercy to some of these people. And many people still have who still have family members in the concentration camps. I've heard them say this because they've said, like, at least we'd be able to mourn. At least we know that they're dead now. Because I know many families, they don't even know if their families, if their mom, dad, brothers or sisters are even alive or dead. They're just like, just give me the news that they're at least dead so I can mourn. Because this hell that they're going through seems to be just much worse.
With the regards to everything you said about the concentration camps, I mean, one of the things which stood out for me is the heartwarming support from the Jewish community for the Uyghurs. And if you think about it, it's so natural because they went through something very similar some 70, 80 years ago. The thing which I'd like to end upon before we open up for the Q&A, and of course there's a lot more information that obviously Arslan has about this topic, but we're just summarizing. Okay, so what are we asking for? What are activists across the world asking for? Look, the first thing I'd like to clarify is we need to first refute all of the claims that the Chinese Communist Party is pushing out. Okay, the first thing that they try and push out is that we're xenophobic, right? The activists are xenophobic. We hate China. We hate Chinese people or anything like that. No, that's far from the truth. The first victims of the Chinese Communist Party are Chinese citizens, right? So there's nothing about China itself, the Chinese civilization itself, which is an ancient civilization, that the Uyghurs or Muslims in general or Uyghur activists are against China as a civilization. No one's making that claim. We're not racist or xenophobic like that. That's the first point. The second point is we're not asking for any rules to be broken. So we're not asking go and attack a Chinese person in Chinatown, go egg the Chinese embassy, or go throw insults at people or this or that. We're simply asking students, and here Imperial University students and Queen Mary and Goldsmith, and apology to all the other ISocs which are involved, which name I don't recall, but it's all on the post and you can actually see it there. All of you guys is use this framework. Firstly, know that your activism has to be legally acceptable. So is it legally allowed in the country that you reside to actually take these following actions? Go onto Facebook, go onto Twitter, go onto Instagram, go onto these platforms and speak about this issue. Talk about this issue, share this video. What is being asked of you is very simple. We're simply asking you, don't break the rules of your country, don't do anything illegal. We're not doing anything illegal either. All we're simply saying is exercise the freedom of speech to defend those people, because like Arslan said, if it wasn't for the Western countries' pressure on China, the oppression would have been far worse. It would have been far worse. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is, does it even work? Does this activism even work? Does it have an impact? Well, it does. And the reason it does is because of the reaction of the Chinese government. The Chinese government has started an entire counter campaign against the Uyghur activism. They've launched their Twitter channels, and they regularly send out trolls that go and post comments like, no, this is all fake, or the Uyghurs are extremists, or you are extremists. So you need to understand that it's hurting their image, and it's hurting their image significantly. So what are the important things to do here is this. One is not to sit idly and think, oh, this situation is just like any other situation that we have in the Muslim world. This is the worst situation we currently have, because if you look at other countries, the oppression that's being done in China, the systematic way it's actually being done, you cannot compare it to any other oppression happening in the Muslim world. And what's important to understand is they want people to disbelieve in Allah. They want people to disbelieve in Islam. So in these concentration camps, they tell people there is no God. And they ask these people as they're leaving, is there Allah? They all have to say no. If you hesitate, you're in trouble. So they have this entire system to actually eradicate Islam. So what we have to do is, the more noise we make, China is like a narcissistic bully. They cannot handle criticism, any criticism, and they go wild. I mean, ask Arslan how many channels he's been banned from, right? Twitter from the Chinese government, they'll ban him simply for just speaking up and saying, you know, you should release the family members of the people who are in concentration camps, and, you know, simple requests, not even asking for independence sometimes, and doing these things. Secondly, it's important not to fall into the trap that the Chinese government is trying to lay. So the Chinese government is trying to lay this trap that we're fighting extremism, we're fighting jihadism, we're fighting these people who are extremists and terrorists. Now, if Muslims, as their reaction, they start doing something like that, then the Chinese government is going to be like, see, we told you. And even the Western countries will back away and say, actually, no, there's an extremism problem. This is extremely important. And the reason why this is extremely important is because at this current moment, it's very fragile, because the Uyghur cause is being supported all across the Western nations, and there's no excuse right now that why they shouldn't be supported. But as soon as someone does anything of an extreme nature, a terrorist nature, whether it's a Muslim who's an Uyghur or a Muslim who's not an Uyghur, then automatically China will have an excuse, Western nations will back off, and they'll be like, see, these people are extremists and these people are terrorists. That's why, understand, all that's being required from you is social media activism, which is within the legal framework of your country. We're not asking for hate speech, we're not asking for extremism or terrorism or anything like that, because as Muslims, we don't believe in that stuff anyway. And you know, we should never fall into the trap that because this is and I've said this to Arslan many times, I've said this would be the perfect thing for the Chinese government, for Muslims to do something which is of an extremist or terrorist nature, and boom, that's it. All the Western support will back off, and you know, the Uyghurs will be the same as Andalusia. We talk about Imam Qurtubi and we talk about these people, they're gone, they're finished. The whole civilization is done. Likewise, in 20 years, unless something is done about this situation, the Uyghur children which are being raised in these orphanages, they will not be able to say La ilaha illallah, they'll just say Xi Jinping. That's all they're going to say. They're not going to understand that they're Muslim. Already we're finding that parents which are kept in concentration camps and their children are actually in orphanages. And we're finding that, you know, China seems to have this strategy of actually raising a new generation of Uyghurs that know that there is nothing except what the Chinese state wants them to believe, which is about socialism and you know, scientific materialism and all this type of stuff. So the activism which you guys, we want you to be involved in, is a type of activism which, one, is Islamically, not only is it something which is halal, it is something which I mean, I'm not a jurist, so I can't give you a particular category, but it's something we will get ajr for. We will be rewarded for doing activism. Secondly, is something that what we're calling for in this particular talk and in all of our narratives is something that's not going to get you into trouble. It's not something that's going to get you into, is it going to get you into trouble with the British government to speak out against China? Absolutely not. Thirdly, and most importantly, I want you guys to realize every tweet, every post, every share, everything that's done on social media speaking out against the Chinese occupation of East Turkestan is something which has a significant impact. I'm telling you guys, as somebody who fairly recently started social media activism against the Uyghur oppression in East Turkestan, and Arslan's been doing it for many years. I'm just telling you guys, Arslan's been doing this for dog's years. He's been doing this for a very long time. It's only recently that he's been given platforms like BBC and Al Jazeera and TRT and God knows what. Why? Because this is the perfect time to actually speak up, because the world is already angry at the handling of the Chinese Communist Party of the coronavirus, and this is just adding fuel. And then one of the charges against them is Hong Kong, one of the charges against them is what's happening in Inner Mongolia and Tibet, and now even the Muslim issue in Xinjiang, in Chinese occupied East Turkestan, has become part of that. So all of the activism that you guys are going to be involved in, inshallah, this is going to have a significant impact. And what I want everyone to do is to start doing now is to start putting up some questions which I can actually post to Arslan. So before, I mean, we don't have any questions yet. So before we start answering the questions of commentators, the question I want to ask Arslan is this. When it comes down to this particular issue that we're dealing with currently, what is the end goal? What do we want? Is it a case of we just simply want China to loosen the grip on the region? Or what are we actually calling for? What is, if you like, the World Uyghur Congress or the Uyghur Human Rights Project or all the different Uyghur organizations, including Talk to East Turkestan? What do they fundamentally want as an end state to this particular problem?
I mean, you sort of put all those organizations into one, and all those organizations have a different goal. So the goal that most Uyghur organizations would agree upon is the closing of concentration camps and to go back to a sort of pre-concentration camp lifestyle. That's what everyone wants, to be able to live freely. Then if we want to take it a step further, we want, say, what we call for is an independent state, because China for the longest time would strengthen their policies or harden their policies and then soften them up, and then harden and soften. So we could get to a stage where policies are softened and concentration camps closed, but then they'll just come back again 10 years later. So unless the Uyghurs can govern themselves, can rule themselves, have an independent country, we will not totally be free. And that's why we refer to our land as occupied East Turkestan. Because then people will go, what's wrong with these camps? The Uyghurs learn Chinese, right? Well, the thing is, why should we learn Chinese? Chinese is not our language. Now, you or your parents or grandparents went to Britain, you have to learn English. Right? I have to know English because that's the language of the land that my parents went to. Chinese came to us. We didn't go to China, right? Why don't the Chinese come and learn our culture, our lifestyle, assimilate into our society? No, they're forcing something upon us. So therefore we reject anything and everything they give us, because that's not how the world, you're going to come into my land and tell me what to do. So we don't want to be occupied anymore. It's like asking a Palestinian, what do you want? We don't want Israeli rule over us, similar to this. So yeah, many Uyghurs would want an independent state to rule for themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we have some questions posted to us anonymously, and Brother Huzaifa Qamar is going to read them out.
Okay.
Talking about to you both for shedding light on this topic and speaking about the harsh realities of what people in East Turkestan face, especially the kind of history and context to it, and seeing that, subhanAllah, from like a first-person view, and it's truly been eye-opening, and I think everyone listening would definitely agree. So Jazakumullah khairan again for that. There are some questions that have been posted, so I'll work my way through them, inshallah, depending on how much rating they've got in terms of upvotes. So the first question here, I think you kind of touched upon this already with the whole kind of steps that you mentioned with legal activism, going out on Facebook and Twitter, Instagram, talking about it and utilizing that freedom of speech. But someone has asked the question, what can we do to help here in the UK? And I think many people have the same question as they've upvoted it quite a few times.
So on this, I would say something very, very simple, right? The first thing which I think is extremely important is this. When it comes to an emotional topic such as, I mean, Arslan and myself, we interviewed concentration camp survivors in Turkey. And, you know, this was something that was very brutal. That was I mean, the sort of stuff that we heard, it was hard to hold back tears. I mean, you know, the baton that you used to strike people that was used to insert into, the female part of the woman. I mean, forced abortions and rapes and fingernails ripped out and all this type of stuff. The first reaction you get from Muslims is they automatically have this thing of, violent protests or something else violent, right? That would fall perfectly in line with what the Chinese Communist Party wants. See, Muslims are extreme. We have a Muslim problem. And in fact, warning of the Western world, see, these guys are also extreme. You need to deal with them the way that we're dealing with them. Because China, one of its very powerful and subtle ways of actually challenging what's happening in Chinese occupied East Turkestan is saying, well, the Western world has laws to combat extremism and terrorism. We simply have the same thing, and we have vocational camps. And it's hard to argue against that when they put it like that. And it'll be even harder if Muslims who get emotional from these things actually end up taking actions which are extreme, of an extremist nature or a terrorist nature, because that will totally derail the very fragile situation that we're actually in. I mean, in fact, sorry to sound like a bit of a conspiracy theorist, but the Chinese government may want to do a false flag, right? And may want to blame it on the Muslims, right? They've already, the American government's smart enough to realize this, that, China had this group that is said was an extremist and a terrorist group. And America's recently come out and basically their academics and their policymakers and everyone's realized it was a ghost group. It didn't even exist, right? And, Arslan has actually interviewed a academic who's actually written a book in which he mentions these types of things. So the first thing is what we don't do. Yeah. So when anybody that does anything like that or thinks about anything like that, that's simply going to destroy what we're trying to achieve. What we do need to do is this. When we have a massive free platform to speak on this issue, do simple things. Change your WhatsApp, picture to the East Turkestan flag. Post about this on Facebook. Use Twitter handles. Do these basic social media things. I mean, the rule I have for myself is once a day I post at least on the issue that of East Turkestan. Now, alhamdulillah, Allah's allowed me to do it more than once, but I just try and make it at least once a day. Whether it's on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, whatever it is, at least once a day. And guys, I'm telling you, I was shocked when I started doing a little bit of activism. People came to me and said, "You're doing a lot." I'm like, "No, I'm not." And they're like, "We never heard of this before you heard of it, before you spoke about it." I was like, "Okay, that's interesting." And I realized, you know what? It's a sneezing effect. If someone sneezes, everyone else gets coronavirus. If you do a bit of social media activism, that one post you put up is seen by 100 people, and then they share it, and it just catapults, right? And it goes far away, and so it goes very far. So we have the social media activism. Other than that, something else which is very important is to write to your local MP, is to actually organize protests. Now, what type of protests am I referring to? I'm not referring to something that, again, during coronavirus is going to, derail. It's going to cause issues or whatnot. I'm saying do protests maybe in your locality. So for example, off the top of my head, if you're at a British university, look out for something known as the Confucius Center, right? Confucius Institutes, they're known as. These are Chinese government funded propaganda departments within Western universities. So what you need to do is you need to find out if you have one. And I know some universities which actually have these. I was recently, not too long ago, I was in SOAS, and they actually have one. I'm not sure if Imperial have one, but this is funny about this Confucius Center. So Confucius, as you guys know, famous Chinese philosopher, but the Chinese Communist Party hate his teachings, and they hate the teachings of all these ancient people. But just to try and make it sound benign, they call it the Confucius Center. But this is a way of monitoring Chinese students. And remember, we're not against Chinese students. They are victims of the Chinese Communist Party. And what you need to do is organize a protest against the Confucius Center. Maybe get together as the Islamic Society and with the Christian Union and with the Jewish Union and with the Atheist Society. Get together with whoever you can and simply send a bunch of emails to your dean, to your chancellor, saying, we would like to ask Why is this Confucius Center here when it is directly funded by the Chinese Communist state? Apart from that, something else that works is stop buying Chinese products. Stop buying products. Now, that doesn't mean, again, we're against Chinese people, but Chinese companies are not Chinese. Chinese companies are owned by the Chinese Communist Party. Every single company in China is partly owned by the Chinese Communist Party. There's no such thing as a totally free Chinese company free of the Chinese Communist Party. It does not exist. So we have to boycott Chinese products, and we actually have to source elsewhere. And it's difficult. I'm being honest with you guys. It's difficult. You know, I recently wanted to get a phone. There's some very nice Chinese phones. I was like, okay, I'm not going to get those for two reasons. One, you're going to be supporting China. Secondly, the technology inside that phone is going to be very problematic for you, because of what Western intelligence agencies already realized, is that there's actually malware in there, which is there to actually spy on people, right? So all of these things combined together, understanding we can't take an action which is going to help the Chinese government, regardless of how emotionally driven we are. 2, social media activism. And 3 is an active boycott and doing protests against the Chinese government. Any other questions?
Thank you for that. I think there was a question from YouTube that we're going to pop on the screen now.
Arslan?
Yeah, it depends on what you mean by Islamic. So there are scholars who are either, like, the real scholars are in the prisons and in the camps. The ones that will go out and speak on Chinese state-run media are essentially the puppets of the Chinese regime, and they will support anything and everything that the Chinese regime does, and they'll say China has done a very good job. And so if we're talking about Islamic scholars, those are the sort of scholars that are left outside, and the real scholars have either died, been executed, or are still in the camps. And the prayers or the khutbahs that are given are only given during the times where tourists or investigators or journalists are allowed into the area, and there is a show put on for everyone. And then you there are many reports, and you can simply find all this information, where I think it was on average of $18 each worshipper is paid as to play a Muslim, because normally they wouldn't be allowed in the mosque, but that day where investigators are around, they are paid, and that's when they'll go and pray.
Yeah. And apart from that, what you'll find online, if you go to Talk to East Turkestan Facebook, or you can see Arslan's Twitter handle, you will see that the masjids are no longer masjids. They're nightclubs. Sometimes there's animals living in the masjids, or they're just closed. And these are not like, you know, here in Britain, we have mosques which are 20, 30, 50 years old. We have the Regent's Park Mosque, which is, you know, considered old for Britain, but it's not really that old. It's no older than, I think, maybe 60, 70 years, or less than that. The mosques in Chinese occupied East Turkestan, they go back at least 1,000 years. We're talking about mosques which are hundreds of years old, and these mosques are being demolished, right? And these are some of these mosques, they should be listed as buildings which you can't even change the bricklay on, let alone, you know, demolishing the mosques. And in fact, what we're also finding is that anybody with a scholarly background, anybody with knowledge about Islam, they are not only being completely, either they're going to be they're chucked into concentration camps, or they disappear, or something like that happens to them, but somebody who's beneath a scholar, somebody who's like, say, a Quran teacher, right? They were targeted even before the concentration camp. So one of the people that we Arslan, what's the name of the sister we interviewed in Turkey who's a Quran teacher?
I forget her name, because I only saw her once as well. I think her name was Fatima, yeah.
Yeah. So that particular sister, her crime was teaching people the Quran, and her detention was like over 10 years ago. This is even
Yeah.
before then.
Back in 2007.
Back in 2007.
Yeah.
Now, I just want to highlight something, right? Allah says in the Quran about Ibrahim alayhi salam that he made dua for what? He made dua for which city? He made dua for Makkah, right? And he wanted this up as a place where the people come together and they worship Allah. And what's very important, I want everyone to realize something. The first thing he asks for is what? Security. And the Prophet ﷺ, when he became a prophet, what did he declare? It as a place which is sacred, right? Makkah is a sacred place. Now I want everybody to understand this. Of the most sacred of cities in the world, the most sacred city is Makkah. That is the most sacred city, and then obviously Medina, and then Jerusalem. However, in the city of Makkah, which is supposed to be a place of safety and security, a Uyghur scholar was snatched, and there's a threat that he's going to be sent to the Chinese government. So not only is it the case that Chinese scholars, Uyghur scholars in China will not actually be able to survive, Uyghur scholars outside of China in the safest city in Makkah, they are being arrested on flimsy charges. So it's a very, very dangerous situation for Islam.
SubhanAllah, the last point that you made, that's actually absolutely shocking. I would have thought if someone wasn't living in the area, wasn't directly causing any harm to that particular government by speaking out against them, then surely they'd leave them alone, let them live out wherever they're living, go to Makkah, go do whatever they want. But
yeah,
if the way that you're describing it is true, then actually there's no place safe for the Uyghurs.
Arslan, could you give some references to what I just said?
Yeah, the report, and I'll share it in the chat, and I think you can put it up as well. I'll probably share the screen. Yeah, it was reported in the Middle East Eye, and yeah, so and the threat, what's quite scary is, as you mentioned, nowhere safe, but Western countries seem to be the safest spot for Uyghurs. So I'll share my screen. And then if you give me the permission, it'll show up for everybody else. Here we go. So this is the reference here, and that's the brother there. Is a Uyghur scholar, and you can look it up. Just simply type in this: Uyghur scholar arrested in Saudi Arabia at risk of deportation. And his crime was basically giving dawah to Uyghurs living in Saudi. That's pretty much it.
And the saddest thing about this is I saw some Muslims defending the Saudi government despite this action.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, we as Muslims, we have to understand that whether you're a man, a woman, or whoever you are as a Muslim, if you give protection as Muslim according to the laws of Islam, that protection is binding upon the Muslims. And here we have a person who took a refuge and he came to Makkah. And the other thing which is interesting about his situation, he's not illegal. He actually resides in Turkey. He's run away from East Turkestan. He's fled his country and he's escaped and he's gone to Turkey, and he has a Turkish residence. Yet he's been arrested when he went to Makkah, and instead of being sent to Turkey, which is what should be happening, this scholar is now, we don't know what's happened to him, but the Chinese government want him, obviously.
Actually, that point that you mentioned about him being released, I think earlier on in the talk as well, you mentioned that actually some of the Uyghurs that are placed in these concentration camps, whatever the kind of government do to them, they do that to them, whether it's torture or whatever else it is. And then actually, some of them do actually come out of that camp. So I was wondering what constitutes whether someone actually gets released or kind of gets kept in there.
Well, no one really knows. And that's actually where that's also part of China's sort of game within Uyghur society, because then what's going to happen is, if Fulan is released, how come he got released but my relative didn't? did he have to give away something? Right? So it's these games that are being played. Is he now working for the Chinese? Right? So it kind of depends, like, even if you are released and when you are released, it's like, that's not necessarily a good thing. Like, on what no one really knows, like, because it's so arbitrary. Why were you taken in the first place? God knows. Why were you released? God knows. So that's also a big question mark as to why people are released. And people give explanations, or they've assimilated. Well, there are many other people that, would assimilate but have not. So, and we have this argument in the diaspora on the outside. Well, I've been campaigning for my parents for 2 years, didn't get released, and this guy is campaigning for 1 month. He's able to call back home, and even just making a call back home. I can't call anyone, but I know many other people who can contact their family members on a daily basis. There are some people like that. So it's very strange how, people deal with things and what's going on. And that even causes more friction within the Uyghur community as well, causing fitna between us as well.
And there's also something interesting that when you were speaking, I just remembered when we interviewed Sister Zumra Dawood, that she said within the camps there is levels of your extremism, which is based upon the levels of your religiosity. So once you're obviously within the camp, when you enter the camp, then they have, okay, this person had a hijab earlier on, this person is that religious. But when you're inside the camp and then they have indoctrinated you, they look out for cues of your religiosity. So you're told, and you enter this classroom, the teacher is in this cubicle so no one attacks the teacher, and you're told there is no Allah, there is no Allah. You are told repeatedly. And as you're leaving, everybody is asked, is there Allah? And each person has to say no, no, no. Whoever hesitates, then they go up in terms of their extremism. Now, every person obviously under duress, they are being whipped and raped and killed, and all these things are happening. So they just conform. However, some things are fitri. Some things, Brother Huzaifa, are totally fitri. I mean, if you fell into a state of, like, for example, you fell asleep and I woke you up, but you were half asleep and you were sort of in a state of hypnosis, and I asked for your bank details, you'd give it because it's just there. So with this sister, what actually happened was she was in the camp and she's younger, she's in her 30s, and there's another person in the camp who is diabetic, and that person obviously needs glucose, right? So they have very low calorie foods, and they have these steam buns which are like pretty much not nutritious at all. But she gave her steam bun to another diabetic patient because that patient obviously needs to eat on time. And what happened was the guard saw through CCTV or whatever it is that she shared food with another prisoner, another elderly prisoner. So they came in and they started beating her repeatedly and viciously. And in that state, just like in the state of sleep, just like in the state of, where you're half awake, half asleep, your fitrah comes out, the truth comes out. She goes, Ya Allah! And that was it. She became the extremist. She became number one. Okay, this woman believes in Allah, so she's an enemy of the Chinese state. And she went up in her rankings, and she was going to dwell in this center. She was just going to carry on in the center until, and the only reason why she can tell us this story is because her husband is a non-Chinese resident, and he threatened to go to the media and he threatened to get other governments involved. That's when they basically got her to sign, you came to the camp voluntarily, blah, 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 you're happy, whatever crap they made her sign. Then she left. Then she went to the US. She actually gave testimony in Congress, I believe, the UN. And she told us this story herself. Her fitrah came out. Her belief in Allah came out in the form of pain. I mean, people, they leave Islam because of, I wanted to marry this girl, and the girl doesn't want to marry me, so I don't believe in Allah anymore. Some people are that fickle. Yeah, we have people being raped, their fingernails being ripped out, beaten, and they increase in their iman, and because they increase in their iman, the Chinese government recognizes these are the biggest threat. Because remember, look, this is very important to understand. China has no war with extremism and terrorism. They have a war against La ilaha illallah. That is their war. And until and unless we understand that dynamic and we understand that framework that these criminals have, we will not be able to deal with the problem that is the Chinese Communist Party.
Jazakallah khair for sharing that. Honestly, it was absolutely shocking to hear that story, and I'm just lost for words. There's a few more questions, inshallah, so we'll move on so that we can get through as many as we can. So okay, one of the questions is, so does the Chinese Communist Party like target your family because of your activism? And if so, like, how do you deal with that?
For me, they haven't, but for others, they have. And I think for me, the reason why they haven't, because I was born and raised in Australia, and they know they can't really, like, the way I go about my activism, there's nothing to stop me, regardless, even if they were to. But there are many. There was something that we shared today on Talk is Turkestan, a CNN report, where, you know, simply for writing posts, there's a girl in Sweden advocating for her cousin who is in the camp, and all her tweets were translated into the Chinese language and the Uyghur language, and they were given to her parents back home. Can you stop your daughter from tweeting? Otherwise, we're going to do this to you. And then they called her daughter in Sweden saying, you got to stop this. Otherwise, they didn't say they'll hurt us, but the Chinese government takes care of us. How can you do this? We sent you out so that you can better yourself. How come you're attacking the government? So this happens to a lot of Uyghurs, whether it be WeChat messages, they're threatened. And even physically, like, they'll be followed. You could be in London, you could be in Sydney, anywhere. So yes, threats do happen, but for me, it hasn't. And another reason is I've been so upfront with the government. So I would approach the Chinese consulate, embassy. They've got all my details. They've got my number. They know where to find me. So I'm not running away from them. So I guess this is the difference. So they try it with the ones that they know they can scare, basically, in short.
Yeah. And Arslan, just on that topic, Sister Gulbahar Jalilov, even though she traveled all the way to Turkey after escaping the camps, after being released, and in part, again, she was released because of the fact that she wasn't even a Chinese citizen. She was a citizen of Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
I mean, she's being harassed even in Turkey. When we were in her apartment, she was saying even, like, she's been chased through the streets. So they will not leave you alone, even in foreign countries. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if, here in London, Uyghur activists, with their families and stuff like this would actually be threatened. There's a question, Brother Huzaifa, from the chat here. Can I take this one? So, Arslan, the question here is, what about the Hui Muslims in China? What's happened to them?
So the Hui Muslims, generally speaking, before 2017-18, a lot of the Hui areas are pretty much like Saudi Arabia, like women in niqab, madrasas, adhan, even the Chinese. When I went to back home, the Uyghur officials were telling me that the Chinese officials in the Hui Muslim areas were going to Jummah prayer, and CCP officials cannot go to Jummah prayer. But today, a lot of the footage of the mosques destroyed predominantly now come from Hui Muslim areas. Like a good 60-70% of those mosques destroyed are Hui Muslim mosques. Their scholars are now being put into prison. They're not being mass encamped like the Uyghurs are, but they're going through what we started to go through 30 years ago. But they too are also now feeling the brunt. So it's a stage-by-stage thing. So you've all heard of the social credit system that the Chinese have. The dummy country the dummy region that they start and they dummy test all of these projects is on the Uyghurs first. So whether it be organ harvesting, whether it be social credit system, whether it be camps, and now we've recently even seen, even though the Jewish community in China is very small, even Chinese people who have adopted the Jewish faith are now also being, oppressed. Chinese Christians are now being oppressed. Hui Muslims. So China, as you said, is against La ilaha illallah, but they are against anything that is against the deen of CCP, against the way of life of Chinese communism. So yeah, that's what's happening to the Hui Muslims. But the most oppressed people, number one on the list, are the Uyghurs.
Yeah, and something else just to mention is East Turkestan is almost 50% Han Chinese now. They've sent in these
immigrants,
people, migrants. Well, they're not really migrants because it's more like plantation, what used to happen during times of colonization, right? And now, sadly, it's not only the case that the Uyghurs are in their ancestral land being oppressed by the Chinese state, but 50% of the population is now Han Chinese, and the Han Chinese act as a proxy of the state. And they spy on the Uyghurs, even though they're neighbors with the Uyghurs. And, they actually openly, the videos I've seen is where Han Chinese people living in East Turkestan would act like the police. They would walk up to a sister. I saw this video which made my blood boil. A sister who was sitting on the floor with her family, and she was wearing the hijab. And it wasn't a police officer. It wasn't an army officer. It was a Han Chinese resident of East Turkestan, an immigrant, who said, "Take that off." And then she had to take it off because she was scared of him, right? I mean, that's the level of psychological torture that Uyghurs go through.
Yeah. And they know it as well. It's sort of like, so for example, you can imagine that if you were living, say, 200 years ago in the United States as a white person, or you were living in the time of apartheid in South Africa, and you've got the government on your back, that's how the Chinese are acting in the region now. So layman citizens who they know that whatever they do, whatever crime they commit against this minority, that they're going to get away with it. So there are crimes being committed on a daily basis that if they were to be committed anywhere else in China, that they'd be arrested for. But because it's done upon a Uyghur, that's fine. A Chinese person did it. How could you? The Chinese is much more higher,
So we have a question, another one, Huzaifa. Can I take the one at the bottom? Ibn Tain. Arslan, what about this one?
Well, if you can, if you look at, if you do some research called Uyghurs in Malaysia, Uyghurs in Thailand prisons, or Uyghurs in Indonesia, Uyghurs around 2014-15 did, in their thousands, try and go through the south of China into Thailand, trying to make their way into either Indonesia or Malaysia so that they can fly to Turkey. So hijrah could be a way, but if they could, they would, basically. Because another thing is, now, there is a lot of Chinese propaganda out there saying, there's nothing going on in the region. But one, the Uyghurs are Chinese citizens. And as Chinese citizens, they have the right to a Chinese passport, and they should be allowed to travel. Number one, why aren't Uyghurs getting Chinese passports? Why are you so afraid to give them Chinese passports? Number two, why aren't people being led in to independently investigate? So if people are giving you things like, oh, there's nothing going on, well, Uyghurs can't leave and we can't go in. Simple as that. Now, I use the example of Iran. Iran are scared to death of sanctions against them. So what do? They go, please come in, have a look. We're not building nuclear bombs. And Europe and the USA go, all right, no nukes, no uranium here, no sanctions on you guys. But China doesn't. China is so strong, they don't care anymore. They're like, we're not going to buy Australian coal anymore. They're able to sanction the strongest nations in the world. That's how strong they are. So if China has nothing to hide, they should be letting people out, and we should be able to go in and check it out for ourselves.
Just going back to the question I was asked previously. So we spoke about the Uyghur Muslims, we spoke about the Han Muslims, you briefly mentioned. Are there any other groups of Muslims in China at the moment? And if so, how are they treated?
So the Hui are the second group, and there are other tiny groups of Muslims. So in the south, places like bordering Cambodia, there's sort of little regions over there as well, and they're also facing, like, they're only newly facing things. So for example, now they've only put a hijab ban on school children there just now, like last year or something. So it's slowly getting to them. So they start with the Uyghurs, we're the dummy region, we're the test region, and then slowly go off to the Huis and the other people. So there are many other groups of Muslims that I don't even know the name of, but predominantly the Uyghurs, the Hui, all the other Turkic people as well. And there's this one group of, really next to Cambodia, there is a group of Muslims, I forget the name now, but they're starting to be oppressed as well. But again, it's Muslim, it's Christians, it's Jews, it's Chinese Democrats. So any ideology against even Buddhism. So the only type of Islam or Buddhism or Christianity that China will accept is a Chinese version of Islam, a Chinese version of Christianity. So again, I mentioned, when there are khutbahs or when there is prayer, the message is, it's not just a softened form of Islam. It's like a totally different message. And China, unless it's a Chinese version of something, China will see a threat to it. Like, if it's anything foreign, they can't have anything foreign. They can't just let things be for them. So essentially what you're summarizing is that actually it's like you said before, it's not a specifically an Islamic problem or a Muslim problem or a Christian problem. It's the fact that anyone that's against the Chinese Communist Party, anyone that doesn't speak their tongue as such, is essentially what they have an issue with. Yeah, the thing is, with the Muslim issue, the reason why it's so amped up, because the Islamic issue is so amped up in the West, because the West understand this, and like the right-wing movements, right, they will lead off that. They would, because as Brother Subboor mentioned, when George Bush said you're either with us or you're against us, China was like, well, we've got Muslims in our borders as well. We've got extremists. So they're using that right-wing narrative for their own benefit. That's why Muslim and Islam is so hyped up in the region. And you don't necessarily hear about Christians being oppressed or Jews or Democrats or other groups being oppressed, because it's not popular. You know, Islamophobia is such a big thing. You got Macron, you got right-wing Europeans, and it's such a big thing.
It's almost like they kind of back off the fact that there's already people talking about it, so they can kind of use that to their advantage. Yeah, that makes sense.
They use the global war on terror to their advantage. Yeah.
We'll take one more question, if that's okay, inshallah, because I know you need to wrap up by about 7:50. And I think the last question, let's go with this one then. So somebody asked, what can we do to kind of stay up to date with the issue and learn more about it?
So basically, I'm not going to say like follow me, but follow Talkies Turkestan, follow Brother Subboor as well. There's a few organizations that I want you to follow: the World Uyghur Congress, the Uyghur Human Rights Project, the Uyghur American Association, my association, the Uyghur Revival Association, and that's within you'll see the link in my handle. So that's where you can keep up to date with what's going on. And Talkies Turkestan, I mean, we're constantly updating. And again, we're the biggest platform in the English language talking about this issue. And that's how you can stay up to date. Obviously, there's a lot of news that the Chinese trolls will put out there as well, like videos of nonsense saying, oh, that's a Uyghur being beaten by, and then, unless it's on our page, don't share or believe it, because even though everyone makes mistakes, but we go through a sort of verification process where we sort of verify where things and what things happened. And also documenting oppression against Muslims. That Facebook channel, they're very good as well. They're constantly updating. Obviously, they document other oppressions, but they're very good on documenting the Uyghur oppression as well.
Perfect. Jazakumullah khairan for your taking time out to talk to us. Inshallah, I hope it's been beneficial for everyone, and I hope we can kind of take away the action points I mentioned and try and play our part, and of course make dua as well for our brothers and sisters in China and everywhere else around the world, because no doubt there is oppression everywhere. That said, inshallah, I'll end it there.
Just before you end it, brother Huzaifa, so I'd like to thank Imperial University ISoc, Kiel ISoc, Queen Mary ISoc, Goldsmiths. I'm sorry for the other ISocs which I didn't mention. I was really moved by the fact that this event was actually organized collectively like this. It's actually the first time that Arslan and myself have been able to actually speak about this issue at a university level. We've done it elsewhere, more so Arslan than myself, obviously. But this is obviously a big breakthrough because it helps us get into other ISocs. So if you have a strong ISoc and you want to put together an event for Arslan, then just get into contact with him via Twitter or through Imperial ISoc, and we will actually facilitate that. The other thing which I wanted to just clarify is that, look, I keep banging on about the whole thing about don't fall into the extremism terrorism trap, and the reason for that is simply because these issues that we're talking about are very delicate geopolitical issues. That's why everything that Muslims do, it has repercussions. And that's why, even today we didn't do justice to some of the topics. But if you go to Talk to East Turkestan, you will see a lot of discussion between Arslan and academics, in which you will start to understand why we are pushing out a certain narrative.
Yeah, I want to thank all the organizations as well that help put this together, and inshallah may Allah reward you in this life and the next, and inshallah we do. And just like someone has written just now, make it an annual event. It shouldn't be annual, we should be doing it on like a daily basis if we could.
Ameen wa iyaakum. Jazakumullah khairan once again, and we'll end it there inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.